Good morning. Glad to be back here with you today. We're doing a series Wednesday through Friday this week on the false promises of sin, looking at various of the 7 capital vices, also known as the 7 deadly sins, and today we'll be looking at the vice of wrath. I want to begin with a confession today, a story. Make sure I get our first slide up here. It's a story about myself and my family. We were traveling one spring break, doing that mass exodus from the Great White North down to the panhandle of Florida for spring break during the week that my kids had off. And I normally can't go on a spring break trip because our college has a different spring break than my kids' school. So we end up both staying home. So it was a big deal. I was on sabbatical. We finally had a week to go. My kids have been hyped about it for months. And we began our trek south. It was supposed to be about an 18-hour drive. And as it turned out that year, there were 2 Final Four March Madness tournaments going on in 2 of the cities that we had to drive through on the way south. So Indianapolis, then we go through Louisville, then we go through Nashville, and 2 of the 3 were just traffic jams because of March Madness that weekend. So we left very early on a Friday morning, hoping we could avoid traffic. Alas, it was not to be. South of Indianapolis, we hit a parking lot on the interstate, and I think we drove an average of 13 miles an hour through the entire state of Kentucky. So at this point in the trip, the parents in the front seat are very frustrated, and the children in the back are certifiably insane. At this point, we decided, hang the interstate, let's get off this road and just take backcountry roads. We just want to be moving along, even if it's at a slow pace. It's better than being stuck in this traffic jam. So off we went on the next exit, and sure enough, the back roads were far more open, much less traffic. And we were zipping along at 40 miles an hour and passing absolutely nothing but a few cows and pastures and a random Baptist church. And then we got to a traffic jam on that road. I kid you not, probably 16 cars deep, stock still. Nobody's even moving. And we're thinking, what is it, a cow crossing? You know, come on, people. What is it with the traffic here? There's nobody around. What could possibly be going on? Well, I started to get very frustrated and lose my cool at that point, and I started saying, you know, what's going on? Can you see anything? And my husband looked out the window, and he said, there's a guy in the middle of the road, and he's walking really slow. And I said, okay, who is this idiot? Who is this fool? He's holding up traffic. Doesn't he know that we're going to get late on our spring break trip, and it's going to cut into our vacation time? And I can't believe that idiot. Well, we got a little closer. Traffic started to move, and we got a closer look at who that guy was. He had a white robe on with a big purple sash. He had a plastic crown of thorns on his head and some fake blood smeared on the side of his face. He was carrying a large cross, which he was dragging behind him on what looked like 2 skateboard wheels. All right. It was Good Friday, and the local Baptist pastor had dressed up as Jesus and done the walk to Calvary right down the middle of the road in front of our car. There was a little ragtag bunch of congregants from his local Baptist church trailing along behind him. And my children's comment was, whoa, Mom, you just called Jesus an idiot. And that's what anger can do. Yes? Right? My spring break agenda. And who is getting in the way? Jesus is. I think that's a thought that prompts me to confession. What does Jesus have to teach us about anger and the way that we can handle it well? That's the question I want to discuss with you today. So we'll be talking about the vice of wrath. Let me begin by saying I want to distinguish the vice of wrath from the emotion of anger. According to Thomas Aquinas, 13th century theologian we heard from yesterday, anger is a natural God-given emotion, and it's directed at justice. Justice is the object of anger. So anger is useful for pursuing justice with fervor and energy. And Aquinas' thought is, if you're going to have a will that is set on justice, it's better to be wholehearted about that. We're embodied beings. Anger is a bodily emotion. Your face gets red and your heart starts beating faster. Better to be wholeheartedly in love with justice and in pursuit of it than to just have sort of a commitment of the will, but not sort of the full emotional complement. And in fact, the picture that we get of Jesus in Scripture, to some people, looks just like that, wholehearted passion for justice. Garret Keizer is an Episcopalian pastor who says, I'm unable to commit to a Messiah who won't turn over a few tables once in a while. And if you live in a world full of injustice, having a holy passion for righting wrongs can be a good thing. Unfortunately, it can also be a hellish habit. So here's how anger goes wrong. Justice, the righting of wrongs, is a genuinely good thing to be for, but wrath is going to count as the disordered desire for righting wrongs. And let me put that in scare quotes. Here's another way to describe wrath. It's the love of justice when it's perverted into the desire for revenge. You might think of wrath as having two components, two ways that this disorder can get started. First of all, the target of our anger can be wrong. We can be after the wrong things. They can be things that are selfish and me-centered. So the first question to ask yourself when you're angry is, what am I angry about? Is it genuinely a just cause? And secondly, how am I getting angry? How is my anger being expressed? Is it helping the cause or is it hurting the cause? So here's just a list or a catalog of different faces of wrath. You'll notice that the object of wrath is typically me, my honor, my agenda, my plans, my expectations. And the mode, of course, the way that it gets expressed can also take a variety of forms. It can be too intense or it can just hang on too long. So perhaps you can see one of the faces of wrath as looking awfully familiar. Summing up, Calvin and Hobbes can help us think about what anger looks like, and he's talking about New Year's resolutions in this cartoon. He says, resolutions? Me? What are you implying, that I need to change? Well, buddy, as far as I'm concerned, I'm perfect the way I am. So if the world would just conform to me and my expectations, we'd be all set. Okay, so anger has a kind of my way or the highway flavor to it. In the capital vices tradition, each of the central vices is rooted in pride and then sort of proliferates into many other sins. So think of these vices, wrath, sloth, and the others, as source sins. They tend to sort of give rise to lots of other symptoms of sin in our lives. And Aquinas gives the following catalog of offspring vices of anger. He starts with your head. He says, anger first inflames certain thoughts in your head. Thoughts that have to do with how horrible the offense was. Do you ever sort of replay the tapes in your mind when someone's done something awful to you and you're angry about it? You sort of rerun the tapes, play it over and over again, get angrier and angrier about it every time you listen to the tapes playing in your head. And so swelling of the mind is the offspring vice that the tradition names for that. And then, of course, we can express our anger in words, in insults, and even in blasphemy. We can be angry at God. And then also in deeds, fighting, injuring others, and even killing. I think if we want to sum up anger, good and bad, it would look something like this. Bad anger is going to be self-destructive in the way that Frederick Buechner describes it here. You're actually destroying yourself with your anger. Good anger, on the other hand, is going to be protective of the right things and corrective of the wrong things. So think of good anger as protective and corrective, and bad anger as self-destructive. Here's another way to sum up bad anger. It's like drinking rat poison and waiting for the rat to die. What you're actually doing is wolfing down yourself at the feast. You're destroying yourself, poisoning yourself. Now, in the tradition I discussed yesterday, from the Desert Fathers all the way through the Middle Ages with Thomas Aquinas, there was a dispute about anger. So even in the Christian tradition, there were voices that said, anger is always going to be destructive. Anger is always bad. And Aquinas is on the moderate end of that spectrum. He's willing to say, no, some anger is useful, some anger is good. We even see examples of when Jesus was angry. Cassian, Evagrius, and others want to say that anger is always a hindrance to what they call pure prayer. Being angry at another person, they say, is always disruptive of our communion with God. And I get students with a very strong reaction to that. They think, that's just way extreme. That's kind of crazy. We're not supposed to shut down our emotions. And they do have a point. But I asked my students to engage in the following exercise. It's an experiment in tracking anger. And so what all of us did in this seminar was keep a journal for a week or maybe 2 of all the things that we got angry about. So you kind of either kept your phone or a little pad of paper along with you, and you had to record 2 things. When you got angry, what was the object of your anger? What were you angry about? And then secondly, how angry were you? On a scale of 1 to 5. 5's really angry, 1 is I'm just a little bit irritated. All right, and if you need 3 sheets of paper to describe what you're angry about, you should give yourself a 5, okay? So the idea is we went through this exercise, we recorded all the things we were angry about, we put the journal away and didn't look at it. Came back to it a few weeks later when we were actually studying the section on anger in class. And then we went back to the journal and we looked at all the things that we had been angry about just 2-3 weeks ago. And then we analyzed, okay, was our anger proportionate and was it directed at the right objects? Can you guess what the results were? How many things in our anger journal over the course of a week were good anger, directed at good objects, and expressed in a just way? Almost none. I mean, approaching 0. So when you think about Cassian and Aquinas and the Desert Fathers saying, no anger is good anger, I hear their position not as a sort of a theoretical position about whether they could ever be good anger. I hear it as a pastoral word of counsel. Most of the time, most of your anger is destructive. So if you're trying to learn to discipline yourself to be more Christ-like, putting away all anger might be a good place to start. So that's one piece of counsel they give us on anger. Discern what you're angry about, figure out that most of your anger is in a bad place, and try to refrain from it. The other thing that the Desert Fathers teach us is that anger usually comes from guarding things in the soul that we would do better to be more detached from. Anger obviously can be good and needfully protective, but most of the time, our anger is protecting the wrong things. In this quote from Evagrius, he says, "Do not give an evil sword to the devil by getting inflamed by anger. Over what, pray tell me, do you fall to fighting, if indeed you have scorned food, provision, riches, esteem, honor, your own agenda, your own reputation? If you've really gotten yourself detached from all those things, what does the dog of anger have to bark about in your soul? If you're detached from ego-laden things, you have less to get angry about. So the counsel is learn some detachment. And thirdly, we get a model in the Desert Fathers of how a gentle word and gentleness can turn away wrath. Rather than sort of giving something back in kind, we can learn from the one who is gentle and humble of heart. So this is a story about Abba John the Short, who's giving spiritual direction on the church steps, and the brothers are gathering around him, sharing their thoughts, and he's sort of helping them discern where God is leading them in each of their lives. And another old man, a rival elder, flares up in angry envy at the sight and says, "Abba John, your cup is full of poison. How can you direct these men? All right, you're full of nothing good yourself." And Abba John, here's the answer, the striking answer. He says, "Yes, Father, it is. I'm just going to take the hit. But you have said this when you can only see my external behavior. What would you say if you saw the inside of my heart too?" I'm guessing the other elder had nothing to say in reply. Right? So let's look now to what Jesus himself teaches us about anger and how to handle it well. I'll begin with the Sermon on the Mount. Wait a minute, I need to be back a slide here. Here we go. So we'll start with the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus talks about anger as the root of the desire to injure and kill and insult each other. Jesus says, "You've heard the commandment, do not murder, but I tell you that anyone who is angry will be subject to judgment, and anyone who insults a brother will also be in danger of the fire of hell." And the catechism that I'm most familiar with, the Heidelberg Catechism, in its discussion of the sixth commandment, do not murder, it explicitly says at the root of the desire to injure and kill is this vice, this desire to be angry. And hatred and envy, if you want to think of those as just sort of different expressions of anger, we can see that the root of injurious behavior is often this desire to push our own agenda in disordered ways. So wrath fuels not only internal disturbances in ourselves, angry thoughts, but it will also come forth in a whole range of injuries, words, and deeds. And so I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like, especially with respect to our words, because it strikes me that for most of us, most of the time, this is the way our anger gets expressed. And so I want to focus in on that. Interestingly, if you read the Summa Theologia, which I would highly recommend that you do before you graduate, what you'll find Aquinas doing is in his treatment of all the types of injuries we can commit against a neighbor, he spends the most time on injuries with words, things that we can do to each other to cut each other down with angry language. So I also want to track G.K. Chesterton on the point that it's our close relationships typically that we find the most angry responses in. God tells us to love our neighbors as ourselves and to love our enemies because they're generally the same people, right? If you think about the people you get the most angry with, it's typically people you're closest to. So let's think about those relationships and how we injure each other with words, and that will be a way to just focus our conversation about anger for a few minutes. There's some interesting psychological research done by John Gottman. Perhaps you've heard of it. He's a marriage researcher, but I think his conclusions can be generalized to most relationships. In less than a few minutes of watching a couple argue, so they'll have put a couple in a room, a married couple, and they'll be arguing, and they'll watch the conversation, and within a minute or two, they can predict with, I kid you not, 90% accuracy whether the couple is likely to divorce or not. How do they do that? They're 90% accurate in their predictions, which is just astounding. They scan for several cues, which they call the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, because that marriage is sort of in a position where doom is spelled out. They destroy relationships, these 4 horsemen. The worst one of the 4 is contempt. It's third on the list there. It includes, and I'll quote from their website, sarcasm, cynicism, name-calling, eye-rolling, sneering, mockery, and hostile humor, unquote. Contempt kills love for another person and makes conflict insoluble, in Gottman's words, because it communicates disgust for another person. Their very person becomes offensive and repulsive to us. It's the ultimate form of disrespect. Contempt dehumanizes other people, and that's the way it destroys relationships of love. My thought is that this has to apply beyond marriage, doesn't it? All human relationships are vulnerable to contempt. I would even say that our culture teaches contempt. All right, think about some of the examples before you. Think about the way people with opposing political views or moral values talk about each other on the radio. Or think about the way TV sitcom banter valorizes the put down and the clever counter put down. Think about the way you lick your lips in anticipation on shows like American Idol. You're just waiting for a Simon to evaluate a performer and publicly humiliate them. Why do we enjoy that so much? Think about the last comments section you read on an internet blog. Or perhaps you're familiar with the clever snarkiness of Tony Stark, who makes contempt so much more appealing than the blunt hostility of internet trolls. We find these people entertaining. We love to trash talk and talk smack, and we use our wit to cut and shred each other. Think about how formed we are by this culture. I think I want to turn now to look at Jesus' example to show us another way. My favorite biblical story about anger and contempt is from the Gospel of Mark. Jesus shows us a thing or two there about love and anger and his healing of the man with a withered hand. The man needs healing. It's the Sabbath. Jesus stands up in the synagogue and makes the man come forward. So it's now a face-off between the man with a withered hand and Jesus and the religious leaders. Okay, says Jesus, look this man in the eye and tell me you're opposed to healing, even on the Sabbath. Tell me that right here, right now, in front of this man. And the leaders refuse to respond. You can just feel the chill. So Jesus is angry at them. What is he angry about? He's angry at their callousness and their stubbornness, their insistence on their own power, their contempt for the injured man standing in front of them. He's yearning for their loving response and frustrated when they will not let him break through. Now, here's the crucial moment. How does Jesus' anger move him to respond? He does not injure. Rather, he heals. Eventually, he dies for the sins of the whole world, healing all the injuries and death that sin causes. A recent Time magazine article interview with Pope Francis asked him which side of the culture wars the Catholic Church was going to be on in his papacy. And Pope Francis responded this way: I don't want to be a cultural warrior. I think the church, and I as the leader of the church, should be a field hospital for healing those who have been wounded in the culture war and other wars. Let's not be combatants. Let's be a field hospital for healing the wounded. Yeah. He's an inspiring man. So I want to read you a story to sum up today about a time that I had in middle school. And you know how middle school is. It's a murderous social world. I came home from school every day with a few more cuts and bruises. The invisible kind that nobody can see, but that still keep you awake at night in the hiddenness of the dark, when those silent tears finally can fall safely. The cumulative effect of that middle school hallway routine was a broken heart. You know what I'm talking about. How would anyone know I was hurting, however, when I could dish it out as well as I could take it, right? I had that defensiveness down. But a life of contempt and counter-contempt can be so exhausting. So on the way home from school, once in a while, I would stop by my grandma's house. She'd be napping on the couch, but she would always get up and welcome me in. She would hug me, so delighted that I could spend time with her. She would sit me down with a hot cup of tea in one of her special flowery china cups with matching saucers, and I would sit at her table with her comfort food and her comforting presence. I would rest my weary heart, and she would listen. She would pour out her love for me, and I would soak it up, thirstier for love than all the tea in the universe. What is the cure for contempt? A sanctuary in the house of love. My grandma was a healer. She was like Jesus. As Christ followers, we need to be known as healers. We are a place where the angry and the wounded could come and find sanctuary. And know that you don't do this on your own power. You've already received this gift from God. He has already offered you a sanctuary in the house of love. He is a heart healer for the angry among us and for those who have been wounded by our anger. God would be delighted if you would come in. He would listen to you. If you come and share a meal with him, he will send you on your way full enough of love to make it through another day of middle school in a murderous world. He will give you enough love to make you a healer too. Thank you.